It's recording everything we're saying.
All right, so welcome to the Summer Garden here in the beautiful city of St. Petersburg. So Peter began work on what would become his garden around 1704. He had a small cabin here originally, and it was meant to be his private refuge. At first, nothing really too fancy as it is now. And it was on an island next to the Fontanka River. And the original plan began in 1707 under Peter's first designer, Ivan Medvedev, who unfortunately died later that year. So then he turned to the Swiss-Italian architect Domenico Trezzini, who started the project, but he wasn't able to really contribute much because he was far more busy with the Admiralty Islands, as one of the early groups mentioned. So then, after the Admiralty side improved after 1710, Peter turned to the Dutchman Jan Ruysen, who worked on the garden from 1711 to 1716, and this is kind of where the garden became more of what it is now, the second stage, so to speak. Because originally the garden was a lot wider, and it extended all the way into the Field of Mars, which was at the time known as Tsaritsyn Lug. But that was cut. What happened was the Swan Canal was cut in 1711 to 1716 by Ruysen to separate the garden from the Field of Mars, from Tsaritsyn Lug. And then so then the garden was no longer as wide, but it extended further south. So now it's this long. So this became the second summer garden. So Peter, he was, as one author described, fanatically absorbed in the garden's construction. He made orders even while he was fighting a war with Sweden during the Great Northern War. He placed orders for a lot of exotic trees and flowers and plants from all over Russia, all over the world, really. And this really made things worse for a lot of the workers in the garden because he was constantly changing his mind, and he would make changes on really minute details. So now the garden didn't really achieve its prestigious appearance until Peter hired the French architect Jean-Baptiste Alexandre Leblond. So as Peter was traveling throughout Europe, he was very impressed by French gardens, which were the fashion at the time. But like I said, at first he originally wanted his garden to be a quiet refuge. So therefore he initially didn't approve of Leblond's plan, which incorporated the Field of Mars. It was his plan was to be a lot bigger. But nevertheless, Peter was very impressed by the gardens of Versailles, Dresden, Greenwich, and elsewhere in Europe. So therefore, he wanted his summer garden to basically be as prestigious as any other gardens of a European monarch. So he had Leblond lay it out in the formal French style, and had a lot of prune trees and shrubs, and the perfect symmetrical curving lines. In addition, he had a lot of seeds, bulbs, roots, bushes, and exotic trees were brought in, as I said earlier. But according to Leblond's, statues and fountains were what would make the garden become really prestigious. He wrote, quote, "Fountains and water are the soul of a garden and make the principal ornament of it. These animate and invigorate it, and if I may so say, give it new life and spirit." So Leblond ended up building about 50 fountains in the summer garden, and a lot of them featured sculptures of mythical creatures and gods, but only a few fountains remain today. And to provide water for the fountains, a canal was cut from the Liga River to a small man-made reservoir near Nekrasov Street.
That would be like on that
Right. And this became known as Ligovsky Canal. And eventually the the reservoir was pumped through flues and pipes to the Bezimini Yerik, which is now known as the Fontania River, well, actually the Fontanka River. It was eventually shortened to just the Fontanka Fountain River, and then across through the pipes. So, the aqueduct. The aqueduct was constructed to carry the water across the river, and the water was originally fed by horse-powered pumps, but later it was fed from high water towers in order for the fountains to work through gravity. And another very important feature of the garden, it's no longer here, but at the time in Europe, grottos were very prestigious. So obviously, Peter had one built. Thank you. Especially with benefits of my... Lovely.
Sorry to interrupt you.
So Peter had a grotto built. It's no longer here. It was located where the coffee house is now located, which I believe is that way. Hopefully we can see it on our way to the palace. And according to Peter, the grotto in the summer garden was supposedly second to none in Europe, but it's no longer here. So, originally Peter had about 250 sculptures in the garden, but only about 90 remain to this day. And the most notable one was the statue of Venus by the Italian sculptor Benazzi. This statue was unearthed in Rome in 1718. And Peter heard about it, and he arranged for it to be bought. He sent someone to Rome, but the governor of Rome at the time didn't want to export it. So the guy, Yuri Kolgrevov, the guy who Peter sent, made a deal with the Pope that in exchange for having the statue of Venus taken to the summer garden, the Pope demanded that Kolgrevov to tell Peter to achieve the holy relics of a 14th century nun, Saint Bridget, from Sweden. So eventually, Venus arrived in a special coach ordered by Peter. It was that prized. So it came to the garden eventually. And by the way, Peter never managed to get the relics of the nun. So I guess the Pope was pretty pissed off. But nevertheless, he got Venus. Now, when she arrived, most Russians were not used to seeing nudity in art. So she was greatly shunned. And Peter was afraid that she would become vandalized. And at one point, he had guards posted next to the statue. And in fact, at one point, she became known as the White Devil. It's not known when Venus was removed from the garden, but it's no longer here. It can now be found in the Hermitage. Anyways, so yeah, in short, the as beautiful a statue it is, the nudity wasn't very appealing to a lot of people. So there were a lot of other statues in the garden which depict tales from Aesop's fables, and some of because the statues had to be removed in the winter for safekeeping, but they would be returned in the spring. But unfortunately, a lot of the workmen were not very well educated in mythology. So what happened was a lot of the statues, when they were brought back in the spring, their plaques would be mislabeled. So visitors such as the Italian Francesco Algarotti noticed that a bust of Ceres, who was bearded, and Domitian, who was crowned. So apparently that was incorrect. So again, a lot of the statues and fountains are no longer here, but still a good amount of them remain. At one point, Peter also had a menagerie, which was originally positioned across the post office.
Closer to the Winter Palace.
Right. And it was originally housed in 8 buildings by the Oval Pond, and it stayed there until it was moved to Makovia Street in 1737. And it's too bad this is no longer here, because it had artificial ponds with fish and swans, water birds, and even a seal apparently. But now the only thing that that's left to remind us of its presence are the swans.
And they're not back yet, but they will be in that pond that we just walked past.
Right. So the garden, being as beautiful as it is, during Peter's reign, would become a social center of the city. It would be a place where Peter would have special events, such as celebrating his birthday. Parties here would begin around 5 p.m. and they would begin slowly and all the nobles would just walk around the alleys and contemplate the trees and just all the beauty to be seen. So yeah, the parties would begin around 5 p.m. and along one of the alleys there used to be a small pond where there would be geese and ducks, and Peter would have small canoes to row some of his guests where they would drink Hungarian wine, and there was even a miniature boat for dwarves of the court, apparently. So dinner would be served near the end of the evening, and because it was, and of course, what was so great about these parties was that it would never get completely dark, so they would go on pretty late at night because it was so light out. And eventually, near the end of the night, they would have like fireworks. So, but after Peter's death, the garden would begin to lose a lot of its prestige, but not completely. But by 1736, during the reign of Empress Anna, a theater was built for outside performances during the summer. But during Elizabeth's reign, royalty began to prefer English-style gardens as opposed to French-style gardens. So that's one of the reasons why the summer garden lost a lot of its prestige. And in addition, the garden lost some of its beauty during a flood in 1777, which destroyed some of the fountains, as well as some of the art and the exotic trees. And Catherine the Great decided to not rebuild the fountains. She just decided at that point it wasn't worth it. But overall, she kept the layout, the original French-style layout. Trees were replanted, and the coffee house, which was built in the mid-19th century, and this.
Can we maybe walk?
Yeah,
down
sure,
and
yeah.
See where the coffee house is?
Yeah, and hopefully we
That
can.
would also give us a chance